Welcome to the Iran 1400 Project podcast, where we explore the past, present, and possible futures of Iran through informed dialogue, independent thought, and diverse voices. From historical insight to emerging narratives, we connect ideas to action in the pursuit of a more just, inclusive, and forward-looking society. Join us as we rethink Iran's trajectory, one conversation at a time.
Zendegi, Azadi. Woman, life, freedom. It's a slogan we've all heard, echoing from Iran, feeling so immediate, so powerful.
It really is. And it feels very modern, very current.
But there's such a deep history there, isn't there? When we talk about Zan, about womanhood in Iran, how is that whole journey tied into, well, the story of the nation itself?
That's precisely what the source material we're digging into today explores. It looks at that slogan, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, and traces the really long history behind why it resonates so deeply now.
Okay.
It argues that the way the idea of Zan and the actual lives of women have changed over generations isn't just part of Iran's civic story. It's actually like a crucial window into understanding that entire journey of citizenship and political life.
Right, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. To unpack that history, the one laid out in this article, we want to see how these changes in women's status, their perception, how that really reflects the bigger story of Iranian identity, citizenship, from, say, the early 1900s asking for schools, right up to today's demands for basic rights.
Exactly. And the article sets it up quite well, I think. It suggests looking at it along two tracks, which often run parallel but sometimes clash.
Okay, what are the tracks?
Well, first you have the evolution of ideas. So how people thought about womanhood philosophically, religiously, culturally, all that. And then the evolution of institutions, the actual laws, the government policies, the organizations, the social structures that shape women's reality on the ground.
And the tension between those two, the ideas and the reality, that's where a lot of the story unfolds.
Precisely. That interplay is key. The article also brings in these concepts like Birun and Anderun.
Can you explain those quickly?
Sure. Birun is like the external public sphere, politics, law, the formal institutions. Anderun is more the inner cultural, sometimes private sphere, the home, cultural life, art, personal networks.
So the story of Zan plays out in both these spaces, not just in government decrees, but also in, discussions within families or through poetry.
Absolutely. And what the source really emphasizes is that Zan itself isn't some fixed idea. It's constantly being defined and redefined by the state, sure, by religious figures, by men, but critically by women themselves, often through resistance, through intellectual work, within both those spheres.
Okay, let's dive into that history. The article talks about an awakening voices period right after the Constitutional Revolution, 1906 to 1925. This is where Zan starts to step onto the political stage.
Yes, exactly. The Constitutional Revolution, it wasn't just men. Women were deeply involved, often behind the scenes, sometimes more publicly. They were already challenging the idea that politics was just a male domain.
And what were they asking for back then?
Pretty fundamental things, actually. Education was huge. Political participation. They wanted a real place, a recognized role in this new idea of an Iranian nation state.
They understood that being left out of education or voting meant being left out of citizenship itself.
Absolutely. But here's the first big contradiction. Despite their role in the revolution, the early laws, like the 1911 election laws, explicitly barred women from voting.
Wow. So they help bring about this change, but are immediately excluded from its formal political power. How did they react?
Well, this is where that Anderun space, the grassroots efforts, become so vital. Shut out the formal Birun politics, women created their own platforms.
Like what?
They started women-run publications, some incredibly bold for the time. They formed secret societies, focusing on literacy, political discussion, collective action. These informal networks were, in themselves, crucial civic spaces.
And the fight for girls' schools became a real flashpoint. I remember reading about progressive clerics and secular figures pushing for it against conservative backlash.
Oh, absolutely. It was a major battle. And it showed a shift in thinking. The argument wasn't just educate girls to be better mothers. It started becoming educate girls because they have a right to participate fully in the nation. It was about their civic potential.
So even with the formal exclusion, the patriarchal norms still strong. This period really laid the groundwork. It planted the seeds for women's civic identity and organizing.
Definitely. It established that women had political demands, that they could organize, and that their status was somehow tied to the nation's future, even if the state wasn't quite ready to see them as equals yet.
Okay, that really sets the scene for the next phase. The Reza Shah era, 1925 to 1941, this is the era of rapid state-led modernization.
Yes, Reza Shah had this vision of a modern, centralized, westernized Iran. And women's emancipation, or at least a certain image of it, was definitely part of that vision.
But more symbolic, maybe, than driven by women's own demands.
Often, yes. The state pushed for girls' schools, encouraged women into some government jobs. It was modernization from the top down.
And this is when the Kashfi hijab happened, the forced unveiling law in 1936.
Exactly. And this is probably the starkest example of that tension we talked about, the idea versus the institution.
Yeah.
The state's idea was unveiling equals modern equals public participation for women. But the institution, the lawmaking veiling a crime, police literally forcing women to remove headscarves, that was incredibly blunt, coercive. It deeply alienated huge segments of the population, including many religious women and traditional communities.
So instead of feeling empowered, for many women, it probably felt like just another way the state was controlling their bodies.
That's exactly the critique. And you also had state-sponsored groups like the Kanuni Banavan popping up.
What was their role?
They were meant to institutionalize women's roles in this new Iran, but they were very much state-controlled, led by elite women close to the regime, not really grassroots or representative of the diversity of women's experiences.
So some doors opened, perhaps, for some women, but the way it was done created these deep cultural divides.
Yes, that's the paradox of that era. There were reforms, state-led progress in some areas, but it often deepened the split between secular elites and more religious or traditional parts of society, precisely because it lacked that foundation of, democratic consent or women's own agency.
Okay, let's move into the next period. Under Mohammad Reza Shah's son, from 41 to 79. Modernization continues, but maybe with more focus on legal rights.
Yes, definitely some significant legal gains here. The big one people point to is 1963 women finally got the right to vote and run for office. That was part of the Shah's White Revolution package.
And the family protection law, that sounds important.
Hugely important.
Yeah.
First passed in 1967, then revised and strengthened in 1975.
What did it actually do?
It really tackled inequalities in personal status law. It put restrictions on unilateral divorce by men, raised the minimum marriage age for girls, gave women better standing in child custody disputes, limited polygamy, and crucially, it shifted jurisdiction over these matters from religious scholars to secular family courts.
That must have been a direct challenge to traditional patriarchal structures.
A major challenge. And alongside this, you saw more women entering professions that had been largely closed off: judgeships, diplomacy, academia, law.
There was also the Women's Organization of Iran, the WOI. What was their role?
They were quite active, advocating for equality, doing research, running social programs like family planning clinics. They often worked closely with the state, framing women's progress within the goals of national development and modernization.
So if you looked at Iran in the mid-1970s, on paper, it seems like women had achieved quite a lot. Education, legal rights, visibility in public life. But the article suggests another paradox was at play.
Yes, the big paradox here was political space. While women gained these individual rights and opportunities, the overall political climate was becoming more repressive. Independent activism, real civil society, was heavily curtailed by civic, the secret police.
Oh, okay.
So the reforms, however positive, often felt like they were granted by the state rather than won through democratic struggle. They lacked that deep legitimacy for many.
And that disconnect, the sense that these were top-down changes without real democratic backing, that fed into the revolutionary sentiment leading up to 1979.
Absolutely. It's why so many women, despite the gains they'd made under the Shah, actually participated in the 1979 revolution. They were hoping for something more genuine freedom, real participation, not just state-managed emancipation.
Which brings us then to the revolution itself and the establishment of the Islamic Republic in 1979, a massive turning point.
A dramatic reversal in many ways for women's rights. The new regime moved quickly to implement its vision based on a conservative interpretation of Islamic law.
What were the key reversals?
The family protection law was suspended, then largely dismantled. Women were barred from serving as judges. The hijab became compulsory, enforced by the state. The minimum marriage age was drastically lowered, back to 9 for girls at one point, though later raised. Gender segregation increased in many public spaces. purges of women from certain government roles.
It sounds like a systematic undoing of the previous decade's progress.
It certainly felt that way for many.
Yeah.
But history is rarely simple, right? The article points out some interesting continuities and unexpected turns. For instance, women kept the right to vote. They could still run for parliament, even under the new rules.
That's surprising.
It is. And then the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s tragically forced women back into public life in many ways as nurses, factory workers, organizers on the home front, heads of households while men were at war. Necessity pushed against some of the restrictions.
And intellectually, things weren't static either. You mentioned resistance within the system earlier.
Yes, especially by the 1990s, this becomes really significant.
Yeah.
You start seeing signs of, let's say, ideological diversification within the Islamic Republic's framework regarding women.
How did that manifest?
Well, journals like Zanan magazine were incredibly important. Founded in 1992, it became this platform for debate, bringing together religious scholars, feminists, activists to critically re-examine religious texts, history, and law, arguing for women's rights and equality from an Islamic perspective. This is where the term Islamic feminism really gained traction in Iran.
So not just rejecting the system outright, but challenging its interpretations from the inside, using its own language.
Exactly. It was a way to critique and push for change from within the dominant discourse. And alongside this, the state itself made some adjustments over time.
Like what?
They established an Office of Women's Affairs, introduced policies that actually supported women's education and employment in certain sectors. Family planning programs were surprisingly successful for a period. And despite all the restrictions, the number of women entering university continued to rise, actually exceeding men in some fields.
So it was a really complex period. Severe rollbacks and restrictions, absolutely, but also resilience, adaptation, and the seeds of internal critique.
A real mix of repression and unexpected forms of agency and resistance.
Which seems to set the stage for the next period, the reform era under President Khatami starting in 1997 up to around 2019, a time of maybe cautious reopening.
Yes, Khatami's election definitely opened up a bit more breathing room culturally and politically.
Yeah.
You saw a boom in women's publications, more NGOs focusing on women's issues, women candidates becoming more visible, even if major legal reforms were still hard to achieve. Civil society started to reawaken.
And technology starts playing a bigger role here, right? The internet, digital organizing.
Oh, and massively. The 2000s saw the rise of what you could call digital feminism in Iran. Campaigns like the 1 Million Signatures campaign.
I remember hearing about that. What was its goal?
It aimed to collect 1 million signatures demanding changes to discriminatory laws. They used websites, blogs, text messages, relatively new tools then to organize, gather support, and raise awareness both inside Iran and internationally.
Did it work?
Well, they face significant state suppression, arrests, website blocks. But did it change the laws overnight? No. Did it fundamentally shift the public conversation about women's rights and demonstrate new ways to mobilize? Absolutely.
And independent media, based both inside and outside Iran, helped amplify these discussions.
Critically important. Journals continuing the legacy of Zenan, satellite TV channels broadcasting into Iran, the early blogs and online forums. They provided spaces for voices the state tried to silence, connecting women, writers, artists, activists across borders.
So the picture by, say, 2019 is that despite the state's ongoing patriarchal framework, women have carved out significant space, intellectually, culturally, and as leaders in various movements.
Definitely. They weren't just participating in civic struggles anymore. They were often initiating them, leading them, bringing their specific experiences of inequality to bear on broader demands for democracy and human rights.
Which brings us right up to the moment that really shook things globally. The eruption of protests following Masajina Amini's death in 2022 under the banner of Zendegi, Azadi.
Yes, her tragic death in custody after being detained for allegedly violating hijab rules. It became the spark. It ignited one of the most widespread and sustained protest movements Iran has seen in decades, notably led by women and young people.
And that slogan, woman, life, freedom, it felt like it captured something bigger than just the hijab issue, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The movement framed the demand for women's bodily autonomy and dignity as inseparable from the demand for life and freedom for all Iranians. It became a universal call against authoritarianism.
The images of women removing headscarves, cutting their hair, it became this powerful symbol of defiance.
A potent form of civic refusal, yes, rejecting state control over their very being. And the movement used this incredibly creative language, art, music, dance, poetry, remembering those killed it. It fused grief and defiance.
It felt different from previous protest waves.
It did seem different. The article suggests that perhaps women in this movement weren't just asking for inclusion in the existing system anymore. They were implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, demanding a fundamental rethinking of the republic itself, redefining what citizenship and belonging mean.
And the global reaction, amplified by social media and the diaspora, was huge this time.
Unprecedented, really. It put a global spotlight on the situation. But internally, the source points out, it also raised a crucial question for Iran's own future.
Which is?
Could this focus on gender become another dividing line, another source of fragmentation within society? Or could the fight for Zan's rights actually become the common ground for building a more inclusive, unified national identity? That's the question hanging in the air.
That leads us right back to the core argument of the article we've been discussing, that the story of Zan, her evolution, isn't just parallel to Iran's civic journey, it is Iran's civic journey.
That's the heart of it. How womanhood has been defined, fought over, legislated. It reflects the possibilities, the constraints, the aspirations of Iranian political life in each era. The fight for women's freedom today is inseparable from the larger call for national renewal, for a different kind of Azadi, a different republic.
And it connects to these broader debates happening now about what freedom and citizenship should even mean in Iran.
Exactly. The push is towards redefining freedom, not just as freedom from constraint, but freedom to participate, to live with dignity. It's shaped by lived experience, especially women's experiences of exclusion and resistance. Citizenship is active belonging, not just a passport.
This source makes an interesting connection here, bringing in the example of Iran's Baha'i community.
Yeah, that's a really thought-provoking point. The Baha'is in Iran have faced decades, well, over a century really, of systemic persecution and exclusion from formal citizenship rights, education, jobs, political life. Yet, the article notes, internally, within their own community structures, they've practiced principles of gender equality and participatory decision-making for a very long time. Women have served on their elected governing councils alongside men since the early days.
So even while being denied full participation in the Iranian state, they've maintained this internal civic culture that actually embodies some of the ideals, equality, consultation, that the broader protest movements are now demanding for the nation.
Precisely. It's presented as this quiet, resilient example of an alternative civic model existing within Iran, demonstrating that the capacity for a more inclusive, pluralistic culture is there, independent of the state's narrative or permission. It underscores this idea of citizenship as a kind of shared moral project.
And that really reinforces the article's final point about the potential and perhaps the challenge of the Zendegi Azadi movement.
Yes, the crucial point being, for the kind of deep transformation that slogan calls for, gender justice can't be allowed to become a wedge issue. The argument is that recognizing Zan not just as a victim or a symbol, but as an integral agent in rebuilding the nation is essential. Gender equality strengthens, it doesn't fracture, the civic imagination needed for a more just future.
It's quite a journey, from those early demands for girls' schools, navigating state feminism, pushing back against reversals, using new tools, to today's incredibly bold cry for woman, life, freedom. Zan's story really is woven into Iran's story.
Absolutely. That trajectory from being a restricted subject or a symbolic pawn to becoming this powerful, undeniable force demanding dignity and defining the terms of freedom, that arc really captures the struggle for Iran's soul, you could say.
So for you listening, the real takeaway here is that getting a handle on this history, the evolution of Zan, isn't just about understanding women's issues in Iran. It's fundamental to grasping the country's complex past, its incredibly challenging present, and the different paths its future might take.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something that comes out of this source material. Really consider that persistent tension we've seen across all these eras, the clash between top-down state control trying to define women's roles and the grassroots, often women-led, demands for dignity, for life, for freedom. How does that ongoing push and pull continue to shape what's even possible for citizenship and collective identity in Iran today?
Thank you for listening to the Iran 1400 Project podcast. The Iran 1400 Project invites scholars, experts, and intellectuals to share their assessment of the evolution of institutions and ideas during the past 100 years to inspire a vision of Iran in the 1400s. If you found today's episode thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. For more content and upcoming events, visit Iran1400.org. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful.